It is important that we examine the Bible not in an isolated sense, but in the history of the universe and the history of mankind to understand what it brings to us today. We know, for example, that the universe was created 13 to 14 billion years ago. So how does the Bible story fit in to the facts of God's creation? Why did he create the universe so long ago, and what has happened in the meantime? The Bible has two beginnings in it. In Genesis, it talks about a beginning, and in John, he talks about a beginning. But it's clear that the John beginning came much further before the beginning in Genesis. And that is because in John's beginning, he's speaking about God's creation in heaven. In the beginning in Genesis, they're talking about the beginning of the creation of the material world, which came much, much later. And it had reasons for coming much, much later. Reasons which we don't discover until we get into the book of Revelations. But just take a look at Genesis 1, 6, and 7. And what we see there is that the prophet is saying that there are waters, and God separated the waters. He put some of the waters below and some of the waters above a firmament. Now, that doesn't make any physical sense, any real logical sense. So what is the prophet talking about? Is he talking about physical water or something different? Well, in Revelations 12, we get a hint of what he's talking about. And that is that in the battle that occurred in heaven, 1/3 of the stars of heaven were cast out with the great dragon, with Satan, with Lucifer, with the devil. And 1/3 of the stars of heaven, is what we know today, is a huge number. It's billions of trillions. There are countless stars in the universe. So that set of countless stars could be considered an ocean of fallen angels. And when we look into mythology, we find hints of this ocean, which is ruled by the god Poseidon, the ruler of the bitter sea of fallen angels. And Poseidon is the ancient Greeks' way of depicting the ruler of the underworld, the ruler of the bitter fallen angels. And he is none other than Lucifer, the fallen archangel, who became the adversary, Satan. And this analogy goes through, and we see that the ancient Greeks also talked about Aphrodite having escaped the bitter sea and risen out of the bitter sea. So what story are they trying to tell us? Because this was an enlightened culture, and this is the culture which became the first Christians. Paul went to teach to the Greeks, and they became the first biblical scholars. Origen is the greatest of these biblical scholars. And he talks about a restoration, the restoration of all things. And he's the one who puts the pieces together, because he understood the Old Testament better than any scholar has ever understood the Old Testament. He is the only scholar who has laid out the 5 Bibles of the time of Jesus, side by side, phrase by phrase, comparing the Aramaic with the Hebrew, with the Greek versions of the Bible that existed at the time of Jesus. And we know by Jesus' interactions with the priests and the scribes that they weren't teaching what the original prophets taught. That's why Jesus was in conflict with them all the time. So Origen found the original meanings of the Old Testament by his comparison in the Hexapla. And he put together the stories linking the Old Testament to the New Testament and talking about the first beginning in the Old Testament is the beginning of the restoration. It's when God created the material world to restore the fallen, to restore the sea of fallen angels back to heaven. And this is the story which is consistent over time. And then Jesus came to open the door to allow the fallen to start to return to heaven. That's what was taught in early Christianity until it was destroyed by the Roman Empire in the 6th century. But this restoration, this huge disaster far in the past, where 1/3 of heaven rebelled against God's kingdom and were cast out. That's who we are. We are those who are cast out, and we are finding our way back to heaven through the teachings of Jesus, through incarnations as humans. That's what the material world was created for, and that's what was taught in early Christianity. Attached, you'll find a paper which describes this path, connecting the Old Testament to the New Testament. And we can think of these books as the early books of the Old Testament were spiritual kindergarten teachings, picturesque, simple teachings. And that's what were needed by the first peoples. They needed simple teachings with symbol and story until we get to the adult teachings that John brought to us through his gospel and through the book of Revelations, which reveal what happened to us. So many think that the book of Revelations is nothing but prophecy. Sure, there was some prophecy, short-lived prophecy, but the majority of what's in the book of Revelations is the history of heaven, how it looked before the fall, how the fall happened, this great battle of Armageddon, which cast 1/3 of the heavenly hosts into hell, and which caused the second creation, the creation of the material world, to restore the fallen, to restore the kingdom of God. And that's what Jesus did. He came to take away the sins of the world. And that was the sin that we all made. So read as much as you can and take into account that the Bible doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in a world that God created. And we can find meaning and reason in the world he created, in his nature. And it's existed for billions of years, and it will continue to exist for billions of years. It's not going anywhere soon, like most Christians teach. I was surprised to learn that many Christians expect Jesus to come back in the next 50 years. His kingdom is in heaven, as he said, and he prepares a place for us in heaven. He's not coming back. There's no reason for him to come back. He's done everything that he needed to do.